I do not remember when I first became aware of HIV/AIDS. It would have been sometime in the early 1980s, I imagine, about the same time everybody else became aware. And it seemed like a weird, exotic, distant ailment that affected a niche group of people who were of no concern to me and my life in rural Maine. Back then, AIDS killed gay men. And gay men were outcasts, forgotten, other. Gay men lived in big cities on the coasts, like New York and San Francisco, not Windsor, Maine, where we lived in a single-wide trailer on a dirt road, far beyond the reach of cable television. When news came on about gay people or about AIDS, I remember my father declaring that this awful disease was appropriate punishment for individuals he saw as not human, but perverse, degenerate, possibly evil. Years passed and I learned some things and eventually came out as a lesbian. I learned that AIDS was caused by this awful virus, and I learned that the government at the time refused to fund research because the people that AIDS affected were gay men and IV drug users, neither of which was seen as a valuable voting or donating bloc. Eventually, I met my first person that I knew who had AIDS. Tom was and remains, he's still alive, a sweet, funny, wickedly smart gay man who was one of the leading HIV/AIDS activists in Maine in that time. Then I met a woman named Terry, and she and her daughter were both infected. Autumn, her little girl, made national news when she was barred from attending school in Florida because people were afraid that she would infect their children. Somewhere along the way, with the support of various celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor, AIDS became a thing we could talk about, even if it remained a punchline to many late-night television comedians, politicians. It seemed as if overnight the world suddenly sprouted red ribbons to indicate support for people affected by HIV and AIDS. The movie Philadelphia came out, starring Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, and they found a safe way to introduce the bias and play bias and fear in America around this awful disease. Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, of course, were undeniably straight, heterosexual, and as such, they could introduce or increase understanding for Americans of the brutality of this illness. Then Magic Johnson announced that he was sick. And so suddenly everybody was wearing little red ribbons. With the little red ribbons of the 1990s are much like the little pink ribbons of the 2000s, a symbol used to raise awareness around breast cancer. And ribbons, while they raise visibility to some extent, don't do a whole lot. But they make those of us who wear them feel like we're doing something in a situation that feels still distant and largely beyond our capacity to address. Wearing a ribbon is a lot easier than working at an AIDS hospice, after all. Wearing a ribbon is a lot easier than talking about Uncle Charlie, who moved to New York after high school and then died and never came home. Wearing your ribbon is a lot easier than acknowledging our privilege and our culpability when the disease struck, but we didn't do anything because it didn't hit us. Wearing a ribbon indicated to others our evolved thinking, our moral superiority. Wearing a ribbon was much less frightening and painful than actually engaging in a meaningful way with the many facets and deep pain of the HIV virus. And we will come back to that. But first I want to tell you a story. Kelly Beard and I began our studies at Andover Newton Theological School in 2011. We were among a bumper crop of Unitarian Universalists entering ANTS that year, but beyond that, we didn't have a lot in common. Kelly came from affluence, understood how to mingle with people without offending them. She grew up in Kentucky and knew about horses and the Kentucky Derby and weird hats. She was classically attractive, physically fit, smart, and her hair always seemed to know how to behave itself. I introduced her to her eventual fiancée, Sarah, but otherwise we ran in separate circles. Except the seminary is really a small town. To some degree, we all knew each other and each other's business. When Kelly was diagnosed with cancer, we were all affected. Her circle of friends visited her when she was hospitalized for surgery and helped Sarah take care of her as she convalesced in her studio apartment at the other end of the building that I lived in on campus. When I learned of her hospitalization for surgery to remove a tumor, I was as upset as anyone. I went to the local grocery store and got a bunch of those little plastic takeout TV dinner tray sort of things and some groceries. And I came home to my apartment and I started cooking. I made meals for Kelly and for her to share with whomever might be helping her. I made shepherd's pie and meatloaf, stir-fried vegetables and roast chicken and stew and beef and mushrooms in red wine sauce and I don't know what all else. I made a ton of food. Then I got someone, I'm not still sure remember who that was, to let me into her apartment so I could stock her freezer in advance of her return from the hospital. Now that sounds like it might be a super generous, thoughtful thing to do, no? We each help in our own ways, right? Except when she came home, Kelly was on a clear liquid diet for several weeks. She'd had large sections of her intestines removed. It was only after weeks and very gently she was reintroduced to foods that required teeth and chewing. But later she started chemotherapy that wrecked her appetite and her ability to keep any food down. She didn't need my homemade TV dinners. I mean, her girlfriend had food to eat, so that helped, but that wasn't the point. I had been responding to Kelly's illness by responding to my own discomfort. So I did the thing that brought me comfort. I cooked. I fussed. I cared for her like a Jewish mother. I prepared all those meals because it gave me a feeling of some kind of control, like I was helping, like I was providing something useful, even though I really wasn't. Because when your casual friend who is not yet 40 gets mortally sick, you want to help. You want to do something, anything, to make this not real, not as scary as it is. Kelly didn't need meals. What she needed was grace, patience, and presence, none of which I was particularly gifted with at that time. What she needed was someone to sit with her in the quiet, in the fear, in the pain, and just be there. I gave her what I needed, not what she needed. I needed to help. I needed others to see me as helping. It was performative. It was not actually helpful. Later on, someone had some of those rubber bracelets made. You know the kind, right? These were in bright green that said Kelly Strong, and we all wore them on campus. And every year on September 28th, Facebook reminds me of her death by offering a picture of my wrist with one of those green bands around it. I wish I could say that I immediately learned my lesson from that experience, but I still have the impulse to cook for someone when they are sick or in crisis or whatever. Sometimes I still do it. Sometimes I remember to ask first, but not always. Fast forward to another time and place, but with another cancer diagnosis of a beloved person. I was serving a small congregation in the Midwest, and one of the young parents in the group became ill with some sort of cancer, I can't remember which kind. The entire congregation convulsed in grief and pain. This group had been through a lot of trauma before I got there, and this news just felt like the world was piling on. One of the members suggested that the group do something helpful for the woman with cancer. I suggested that maybe they ask what she needs, before cooking 4 dozen TV dinners, maybe. But so deep in their feelings were they, and so new to ministry was I, that their efforts marched forward to make her a fuzzy blanket out of 2 pieces of polar fleece with the edges cut into strips that were then tied together. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that particular creature. This woman was an artisan quilter. It would be like me going to Walmart and getting a sweater for Betty. I mean, this woman had one of those giant frame things, and one of those fancy sewing machines that let her freestyle designs into the fabric. The fabric she used was high quality cotton, and her work was exquisite. I would bet that there was not, nor does there ever now, exist a single thing in her home that was made of fuzzy fleece. Try as I might, I could not dissuade the congregation members from making this blanket for her in favor of stuff she might actually use, like coupons to takeout places or a diaper service. They proudly presented her with their gift, and she was gracious in her thanks. I have my hunches about the status of that blanket in her organic household, but whatever. In this situation, I learned another lesson about grace and presence. And that is sometimes people are hurting and need to do a thing, or they will implode with the overwhelming feelings they are having. The young mother was sick, yes, and she and her family were dealing with big trauma. And the members of that congregation were also dealing with her trauma, and they needed an outlet for their anxiety. If I knew then what I know now, I may have found other ways to steer them into a more helpful direction, but maybe not. We all do the best we can when we can. Those 2 stories are illustrations of what I mean when I say that much of our responses to big, scary things is more about performance than presence. My friend Kelly and that young parent both needed support from their communities, but the communities were not well equipped to offer what they needed. Sitting quietly with someone while they hurt this much is so much more difficult than it may sound at first. It requires of us a certain level of vulnerability, an ability to place ourselves in the other person's situation and get a glimpse of what they are feeling. A few weeks ago, I visited Al Lumpkin in the hospital after he'd had surgery. For the record, Al was perfectly fine without pastoral care and wanted to talk about the worship schedule. After our visit, I stopped by the emergency department where I met Lois Passy, as she was waiting for doctors to finish up with a trauma patient before she could meet with them. Presence is what Lois is doing in her work now as a clinical chaplain, and it is every bit as challenging as one might imagine. For the most part, Lois spends her time meeting and visiting with people who are in a scared, terrible space where they feel like they have no control over anything. And her job is not to alleviate any of those issues or to fix anything, but to sit with the patient in their fear and be present. Her job is not to fix anything, but to offer the ministry of presence. For those of us who are accustomed to fixing things, I can assure you this practice of presence can be deeply challenging. The most she is able to offer most folks in the way of physical support is holding a hand while they talk. So how then do we practice presence? It is possible to be present when we let go of our own feelings around an outcome. And when you love somebody, you have feelings about the outcome. It is possible to be present when we listen with an open heart. It is possible to be present when we say, I see you and your pain, and it's real. We can be present when we engage in the Buddhist practice of letting go. Letting go of our egos, letting go of our agendas, letting go of our anger and our rage at whatever it is that is hurting our beloved one, letting go of our desires. Simple presence is one of those things that is simple, but not easy. Sort of like a marathon. It's simple, you just run until it's over, but it is not easy. Presence requires practice and self-forgiveness because none of us get it right the first time, or the second, or for many, many times. And none of us gets it right all of the time. We are human, after all. Back to those red ribbons for a moment. As we prepare to end the service and enjoy our potluck feast, which I can smell from here, I want to invite you to pause for a moment and consider when you might have been helping out of your own anxiety or feelings of helplessness, and not out of the need of those we wish to support. I have a colleague who refers to this when her children does it as being helpy. They're being helpy. They may not actually be helping, but they're being very helpy. I invite you to ask yourself, is this TV dinners or is this actually help? Is this red ribbon to show that I am doing work or to make me feel better? How can I be present for someone in this moment? November has been, let's just say, busy. As we move into December, I want to invite you to pause each day to be present where you are. Because being present with somebody else requires us to understand where we are in our situation. Check in with your body, your mind, your heart. Am I here in this moment, or am I spread out over the past or the future, or the groceries I need to pick up, or that argument we had at Thanksgiving that I regret? What is happening around me? Am I connected to others, to the earth, to the air, to other humans in my sphere? And we breathe in and we breathe out. A colleague once described ministry as the fine art of showing up, shutting up, and being. And for those of us who like to talk, whoo, baby, that's hard. But being present is a spiritual practice. And practice means we have to keep at it. And we keep keeping at it until it becomes our nature. May we all be blessed with a feeling of presence today and in the weeks and days ahead. Amen.